In the heart of Rome, behind walls that have stood for centuries, lies an institution more secretive than the CIA, more powerful than many central banks, and older than most nations. It operates without public oversight, answers to no government, and handles billions of dollars while maintaining complete financial opacity. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is documented financial history. For over 500 years, the Vatican has operated what some financial historians consider the world's most sophisticated shadow banking system. A network that helped finance empires, funded wars, and shaped the global flow of money in ways most people never realized. Tonight, we trace the hidden monetary pathways that connect medieval Italian banking houses to modern offshore finance. We follow the money through 5 centuries of documented transactions, papal scandals, and financial innovations that changed how wealth moves across borders. This is the story of how religious authority became financial power, and why some economists argue that understanding the Vatican's banking system is essential to understanding how money really works in the modern world. The foundation. To understand the Vatican's financial system, we must first understand its origins. In 15th century Italy, banking was not just business, it was statecraft. The Medici family of Florence had mastered an art that would reshape European power, using money to buy influence and using influence to multiply money. When Giovanni de' Medici established his banking houses across Europe in the early 1400s, he created more than a business. According to financial historians, he pioneered what we now call correspondent banking, a network where money could move across borders without physically transporting gold or silver. But there was a problem. The Catholic Church officially prohibited usury, charging interest on loans. This created what some scholars call a financial paradox. The Church needed money to fund its operations, but its own doctrine prevented it from participating in the banking revolution transforming Europe. Some researchers suggest that the Vatican's solution was elegant in its complexity. Instead of directly engaging in banking, according to documented historical records, church officials began developing what we might recognize today as the world's first offshore financial structure. The foundation for this system had been laid centuries earlier by the Knights Templar. Before their dissolution in 1307, the Templars had created what many historians consider Europe's first international banking network. They issued letters of credit, managed pilgrim finances, and operated what amounted to medieval wire transfers. When King Philip IV of France destroyed the Templars in 1307, their financial innovations didn't disappear. According to researchers who have studied Vatican archives, many of these banking techniques were quietly absorbed into the Church's financial operations. Dr. Barbara Freil, a Vatican secret archive researcher, has documented how the Church inherited not just Templar properties, but their financial methodologies. The same techniques that allowed medieval knights to move money across Crusader territories would later help the Vatican move wealth across Renaissance Europe. By the late 15th century, several Italian banking houses had become what we might call papal bankers. The Fugger family from Germany, for instance, helped finance papal campaigns, and received mining rights in return. According to historians, this created a precedent that would last for centuries. The Vatican trading spiritual authority for financial services. Some scholars argue that this relationship fundamentally changed both banking and religion. The Church gained access to sophisticated financial instruments, while bankers gained something even more valuable: the moral authority to charge interest under religious protection. When Pope Julius II decided to rebuild St. Peter's Basilica in 1506, he faced a familiar problem: how to raise enormous sums without violating church doctrine. The solution, according to financial historians, established what would become a template for Vatican finance for centuries to come. Julius II authorized the sale of indulgences, essentially spiritual services sold for money. But according to documented records from the time, the financial structure behind this system was far more sophisticated than most people realized. The invisible network. As European banking evolved, so did the Vatican's financial arrangements. In the 17th century, Swiss banking houses began offering services that some financial historians describe as the precursor to modern offshore banking. Complete secrecy, numbered accounts, and no questions asked about the source of funds. According to researchers who have studied this period, Vatican finances began flowing through Swiss intermediaries as early as the 1600s. This created what some economists call the world's first layered financial structure. Money moving through multiple institutions to obscure its origin and destination. The beauty of this system, according to financial historians, was its deniability. The Vatican could claim it wasn't directly engaged in banking while simultaneously benefiting from some of the most sophisticated financial instruments in Europe. The Society of Jesus, founded in 1540, added another layer to this financial network. Jesuit missionaries weren't just spreading Christianity, they were establishing what some historians describe as a global intelligence and financial network that stretched from Beijing to Brazil. According to documented historical records, Jesuit houses served as correspondent banks, collecting donations, managing local finances, and transferring funds across continents. This created what some researchers call the world's first global financial network, centuries before modern international banking. Father Matteo Ricci's mission to China in the late 16th century, for example, wasn't just religious. According to financial historians who have studied Jesuit archives, it established financial relationships that would channel Chinese silver through Vatican networks for centuries. The Napoleonic Wars of the early 1800s created what historians call the first major test of the Vatican's financial resilience. When French forces occupied Rome in 1798, and again in 1808, they didn't just capture territory. They attempted to seize the Church's wealth. According to documented records from this period, French officials were surprised to discover that much of the Vatican's wealth had seemingly vanished. What they found in papal palaces was only a fraction of what they expected. Some financial historians suggest this was the moment when the Vatican's offshore financial system proved its effectiveness. While Napoleon could seize physical assets in Rome, the wealth flowing through Swiss, Austrian, and even British intermediaries remained beyond his reach. Dr. John Pollard, a historian who has studied Vatican finances extensively, argues that this period established a pattern that would persist into the modern era. The Vatican maintaining financial independence by keeping its wealth distributed through international networks. The modern machine. The unification of Italy in 1870 created what some historians call the Vatican's greatest financial crisis. When Italian forces seized the Papal States, the Church lost not just territory, but its primary source of temporal income. According to financial historians, this crisis forced the Vatican to accelerate its transformation from a temporal power dependent on land to a spiritual authority dependent on financial networks. The solution came through what some researchers describe as the Rothschild partnership. While this arrangement has been the subject of various theories, documented evidence shows that several European banking houses began providing financial services to help the Vatican adapt to its new circumstances. As the 20th century began, the Vatican faced a choice that would define its financial future. It could either accept its reduced circumstances or develop what some economists call a post-territorial financial strategy. According to historians who have studied this period, Pope Pius X authorized what amounted to a complete restructuring of Vatican finances. This included establishing formal relationships with international banks, standardizing accounting procedures, and creating what we might recognize today as a modern financial institution. Some financial historians argue that this modernization process established many of the practices that would later characterize offshore banking: complex corporate structures, multiple jurisdictions, and financial opacity justified by institutional privacy. The Lateran Treaty of 1929 created Vatican City as an independent state, but it also did something else that received less attention. It established the legal framework for the Vatican's financial autonomy. According to the treaty's financial provisions, Vatican City would have its own currency, postal system, and, most importantly for our story, complete control over its financial institutions without external oversight. Some economists argue that this created something unique in international finance: a sovereign entity with all the legal protections of statehood, but none of the transparency requirements that most governments face. The Banco Ambrosiano scandal. In 1942, as World War II raged across Europe, Pope Pius XII quietly established the Institute for Religious Works, known in Italian as the Istituto per le Opere di Religione, or IOR. According to the founding documents, the IOR's mission was simple: to provide banking services for religious congregations, church employees, and Catholic institutions worldwide. But some financial historians argue that the IOR's actual structure was far more sophisticated than its stated mission suggested. It operated with complete financial secrecy, answered only to the Pope, and maintained what amounted to diplomatic immunity for its operations. In the decades following World War II, the IOR expanded rapidly. According to documented records, it began offering services that some financial analysts describe as indistinguishable from those provided by Swiss private banks. Numbered accounts, bearer bonds, and what some researchers call ecclesiastical shell companies became standard offerings. The Vatican's diplomatic status meant these services could be provided without the oversight requirements that governed other international banks. According to investigative journalists who studied this period, wealthy individuals from across Europe began using IOR services not for religious purposes, but for what we would now call tax optimization and asset protection. In the 1960s, the IOR established a relationship with Sicilian banker Michele Sindona that would eventually expose some of the institution's more controversial practices. According to court records from later prosecutions, Sindona helped the IOR navigate what prosecutors called a complex web of international financial transactions. This included investments in companies that some investigators later described as fronts for money laundering operations. When Sindona's empire collapsed in the 1970s, investigations revealed what some prosecutors called systematic financial irregularities involving Vatican accounts. According to legal documents, millions of dollars had moved through IOR accounts in ways that investigators struggled to trace. The Vatican's most serious financial scandal emerged through its relationship with Roberto Calvi, chairman of Banco Ambrosiano, and a man the Italian press called God's banker. According to investigators who later examined the relationship, Calvi and IOR officials developed what prosecutors described as an intricate system for moving money through offshore companies and shell corporations. The system, as later revealed in court documents, involved creating companies in Panama, Luxembourg, and other jurisdictions that existed primarily to facilitate financial transactions that investigators could not easily trace. When Banco Ambrosiano collapsed in 1982, investigators discovered what they called a $1.3 billion hole in the bank's accounts. According to court records, much of this money had disappeared through transactions involving Vatican-related entities. Roberto Calvi was found hanging under Blackfriars Bridge in London in June 1982. While officially ruled a suicide, the circumstances surrounding his death added another layer of mystery to what investigators called one of Europe's largest financial scandals. Modern revelations. The Banco Ambrosiano scandal forced the Vatican to confront what some analysts call the modern reality of international finance. Complete opacity was no longer sustainable in an interconnected global financial system. Through the 1980s and 90s, international pressure mounted for the Vatican to adopt what other financial institutions call standard transparency measures. According to published reports, this pressure came from both European banking regulators and the United States Treasury Department. Some financial analysts argue that the Vatican faced a choice: adapt to modern transparency requirements or risk losing access to the international financial system entirely. Under Pope John Paul II, the Vatican began what some observers call a gradual process of financial modernization. This included hiring international auditing firms, implementing new accounting standards, and establishing what amounted to internal compliance procedures. According to published reports from this period, these reforms were met with what some Vatican observers describe as internal resistance. Traditional practices that had operated for decades were not easily changed. Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, later Pope Benedict XVI, reportedly supported reforms that would bring Vatican financial practices more in line with international standards. But implementation proved challenging. In 2012, what became known as the VatiLeaks scandal exposed internal Vatican documents that some journalists described as revealing ongoing financial irregularities within the Vatican's banking operations. According to published excerpts from these documents, Vatican officials were concerned about what some internal reports called continued problems with money laundering, questionable transactions, and insufficient oversight procedures. The scandal led to the arrest of Pope Benedict's personal butler and created what some Vatican observers call a crisis of confidence in the Church's financial management. When Pope Francis became Pope in 2013, he inherited what some analysts describe as a Vatican banking system under intense international scrutiny. Money laundering investigations were ongoing, and European regulators were demanding compliance with international banking standards. According to published accounts, Pope Francis moved more aggressively than his predecessors to address what he called financial irregularities within the Vatican. This included hiring international consultants, implementing new oversight procedures, and reportedly firing several high-ranking financial officials. In 2014, the Vatican established the Financial Information Authority, or AIF, an oversight body designed to ensure compliance with international anti-money laundering standards. Today, according to published financial reports, the IOR operates much like a conventional private bank. It publishes annual reports, undergoes external audits, and claims compliance with international banking standards. However, some financial analysts argue that complete transparency remains elusive. The Vatican's sovereign status still provides what some experts call unique protections for its financial operations. According to researchers who monitor international finance, the IOR continues to operate with a level of privacy that would be impossible for banks in most other jurisdictions. The lasting impact. Some financial historians argue that understanding the Vatican's banking system is crucial to understanding how modern offshore finance developed. Many of the techniques the Vatican pioneered, complex corporate structures, multiple jurisdictions, and privacy protections, became standard features of international banking. The idea that wealth could be protected through religious or diplomatic immunity influenced the development of what we now call the offshore banking industry. Tax havens from Switzerland to the Cayman Islands adopted variations of practices that some researchers trace back to Vatican financial innovations developed over centuries. According to financial analysts who study international money flows, the Vatican's banking relationships created what they call network effects that persist today. Correspondent banking relationships established decades ago continue to facilitate financial transactions between institutions that some researchers describe as components of a broader offshore financial ecosystem. The perpetual mystery. As we stand before the walls of Vatican City today, we see not just the center of Catholic Christianity, but what some financial historians describe as one of the world's most enduring financial institutions. For over 500 years, The Vatican has operated banking services that some analysts argue pioneered many of the techniques we now associate with international finance. From medieval correspondent banking to modern offshore structures, the institution has adapted to changing financial realities while maintaining its essential character. The scandals that periodically surface, from Banco Ambrosiano to Vatican, reveal what some researchers call the inherent tensions in an institution that must balance spiritual mission with financial reality. Some economists argue that the Vatican's banking system demonstrates how traditional institutions can maintain relevance across centuries by adapting their methods while preserving their core advantages. Others suggest that the Vatican's financial history reveals something more fundamental about how power and wealth interact in human societies. According to this view, the Vatican's banking system is not an anomaly, but rather a clear example of how institutional authority can be converted into financial advantage. If history provides any guidance, some researchers suggest that the Vatican will continue adapting its financial practices to changing circumstances while maintaining its fundamental character. This pattern of adaptation and continuity, according to institutional historians, has allowed the Vatican to survive political upheavals, financial crises, and regulatory changes that destroyed other institutions. As we conclude this examination of 5 centuries of Vatican banking, perhaps the most important question is not what the institution has done, but what its example reveals about the nature of financial power itself. Some historians argue that the Vatican's financial evolution demonstrates how traditional forms of authority, religious, moral, institutional, can be successfully translated into modern financial advantage. Others suggest that the Vatican's banking history reveals something more fundamental, that in human societies, those who control the flow of information often end up controlling the flow of money. What remains undebatable, according to financial historians, is that understanding how the Vatican developed and maintained its financial networks provides crucial insights into how modern international finance actually operates. Because in the end, the Vatican's banking system is not separate from the global financial system. It helped create it. History doesn't repeat, but in the quiet corridors where money meets power, the echoes are unmistakable.